Alex Garrett.
As we end this Memorial Day week, a couple of thoughts here on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network. If you were wondering, I was out and about at the Nassau County Games for the Physically Challenged, something that close to my heart and close to the heart of the Viscardi community, HVS family community. And we got to see the alumni play basketball. We got to see JV and varsity and the Cubbies play ball as well. And we also got to see a few athletes play in other sports. And there's one picture now on my Facebook. Multiple generations of Viscardi once again showing up to the games. And it's always special. Big thanks to County Executive Bruce Blakeman, who was there as well to not only support and fund the games, but be there to be an active participant with the kids. And I heard Friday was wild, and I hope to be there all weekend next year. And we'll see what happens. But again, another special moment. And of course, my father was in our hearts. And it's always tough to go to these different things and say, well, what happened to your dad? Where's your father? And you have to say, well, my father has passed on. But that was the reality. And didn't have too much of a meltdown, but it hit me for a moment. And, we just went, Gabby and I went in honor of my dad. And it was a special weekend in Nassau County at the Nassau Community College at the Hofstra dorms. And definitely look forward to doing all that again next year as well. Didn't get much audio because we were busy running around the grounds yesterday and Friday night. But just cool to report that, yes, we continued that tradition this week. But to end Memorial Day week, I have this question, which was drawn about by an incredible interview Politico did with one Daniel Ellsberg. If you may not know who Daniel Ellsberg is, he is Politico's person of interest by Michael Hiraschi, who's a former foreign editor and chief diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek, national editor, former for Politico magazine. And he wrote a Q&A wrote about a Q&A he did with Daniel Ellsberg. If you know the name Daniel Ellsberg, then you know about the Pentagon Papers. He was the one that leaked the Pentagon Papers more than 50 years ago. Now, his story was actually documented in the movies as well, and it was sort of a prequel to the movie about Watergate, right? It was a prequel to that, and it was a very important prequel because I didn't know this, but what Daniel Ellsberg did set off a chain reaction. Of course, he handed over copies of the 7,000 top secret history of the lies, 7,000-page top secret history of the lies and self-deceit that drew America into the Vietnam War. He leaked these papers to the New York Times and other newspapers in 1971. And he was seen as a hero to some, but not to the government. Not to the government at all. In fact, Nixon not only erupted in outrage over the leak, according to Hirsch, but he created the plumbers unit. So what Daniel Ellsberg did create a chain reaction, which led to Watergate. And of course, Watergate led to Nixon's resignation and the dismissal of all charges against Ellsberg on grounds of improper government conduct, because Nixon proved to be, crooked as ever, and more crooked than what Ellsberg was doing. Watergate may have well prevented further escalation and shortened the war because it undermined Nixon's authority, as Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wrote in the first volume of his memoirs, White House Years. The war ended in April of 1975, and yes, it's true that would not have happened if Ellsberg did not come forward. Now, what's interesting is in reading this article is his son, Robert Ellsberg, at the time of 13, made all these copies to send to the New York Times. Imagine a 13-year-old doing that. That is very powerful to speak out like that. And why is this important today to talk about the memorial of whistleblowers? Why maybe they should get a wreath as well. Because Daniel Ellsberg has pancreatic cancer and is dying. But Michael Hiraschi got this one interview on paper. And how cool is it that he did? Because in this, there's a wide range of advice, and you're going to see it in the description, that he has for those that want to come forward. He describes that there's a difference between leaking and whistleblowing. He sees that the American government still lies about what they're doing in covert operations, and he believes, according to Hirsch, that the U.S. chided Putin to go into Ukraine and deliberately start a war. Well, of course, we haven't had a war in a while. We haven't had to use our systems in a while, so maybe that makes sense. And you can say, well, he's 92. He's just talking out of nowhere. But it is suspicious that once Biden got into office, Putin went right to war about a year and change later. Of course, Ellsberg did more than just the Pentagon Papers. According to Hirsch, he also talked about nuclear strategy. He revealed nuclear strategy during the Cold War, secretly based on war plans that would have left hundreds of millions of civilians dead, and how dangerous the nuclear threat remains today. That's what Ellsberg did in addition to the Pentagon Papers. When he started to see what Nixon was saying and hearing what all these other politicians were saying about the war, he was like, well, I have some intel information here. I'm going to share it because what the American government's telling us is a lie. Ellsberg, as I mentioned, says there's still a covert empire around the world embodied in the U.S. domination of NATO. He called the mainstream media complicit in allowing the government to keep secrets it has no right to withhold, and that any notion Americans are ever the good guys abroad has always been false. He says, in my last days here, very simply, how many Americans would know any one of the following cases, let alone 3 or 4 of them? Then he rattled off a series of coups from Iran in 1953, Guatemala, Indonesia, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Brazil, and Chile. You have to read this article. Because he is still sharing some wisdom for the future that we must always question. And so, does the questioning of these whistleblowers, as taboo as it might be to reveal classified information, unleash it to the media, to the Congress, to the world, it's an act of bravery, is it not? Is Snowden not brave? Is Chelsea Manning not brave? I mean, I just think both of them did it a little differently and with less style. But some might contend they are brave. So when these whistleblowers do die off, should they get a memorial as well for actually preventing more war? And for their actions leading to not only their own jailing, their own lives being at stake, their own sacrifices being made, but for standing up for the American people. Should they have a wreath laid down on Memorial Day as well? Should we add whistleblower heroes and healthcare heroes to the conversation Memorial Day? That is what this article about Daniel Ellsberg is prompting me to ask you right now on the Sunday Pod. Because Ellsberg didn't have to do this. He didn't have to risk his whole life for this. He didn't have to And he encourages those ahead of him to know what they're getting into, especially with the abuse of the Espionage Act. That is now getting expanded into what whistleblowers are trying to accomplish, which is just tell the American people the truth. He said, leaking is part of the way the system works. It has nothing to do with revealing wrongdoing. Which, of course, he believes whistleblowing is that. Ellsberg was a Harvard-educated U.S. Marine. Did you know that? Who in the beginning completely bought into the Cold War struggle against communism, including the domino theory. Then he went to work for the Defense Department and Rand Corp, and he thought the U.S. was a force for democracy in the Third World, as in Korea, and the former colonial world, and for self-determination, sovereignty, and peace. He thought we were the good guys, quote unquote. But then he started to hear from contacts in the Nixon administration that Nixon was planning to escalate the war. That is when Daniel Ellsberg stepped in. And so if anything that this article gives you today, it's not only wisdom from this whistleblower, it's also reminding us that there's a very generational gap between whistleblowers from then, like Frank Serpico, which a movie was made after, by the way, and Daniel Ellsberg, and today's whistleblowers, who, he says, want to do it for self-promotion. But see, if there are more people that are inspired to speak up, maybe, just maybe, that is how we gain peace around the world. Maybe learning and hearing from people like Daniel Ellsberg, the man behind the Pentagon Papers, will give us some more hope and insight in the minds of those that do whistleblow. We tend to sort of judge right away when someone leaks or releases classified information to the media or even Congress, if Congress decides to release it. That, they're harming the government by sharing our secrets. But what Daniel Ellsberg is doing, and what I think Michael Hiraschi is doing, what this article is showing, though, what these whistleblowers are doing is maybe their job. And maybe their duty as an American to stop even more havoc from happening. Maybe if we read these stories of Ellsberg and Serpico and Ian Fishback, who was a dedicated U.S. Army captain, revealed the torture practices at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq were systematic, not isolated incidents. He actually, only to suffer criticism, mental illness, and die years later in a charity hospital. And then there was Reality Winner, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaking details of Russian infiltration in the 2016 U.S. election. And now we look at today, and it looks like they can't get the witnesses to the Hunter Biden situation. Comer is doing a great job looking into what the Biden scheme was, but he's not getting the witnesses. I don't know what this repairman of the laptop's going to say, or what he said in the deposition of 7 hours, but maybe those that know more about what's going on with the Biden family should speak up to give the American people a bigger picture out of 2024. So, while you may think whistleblowing is not patriotic, from where I stand and reading this article fully, what Daniel Ellsberg did and what he's doing now by putting his thoughts on record with Politico is setting the stage for future inspiration and future generations that want to come forward and say, look, This is not right. What's going on and what we're being told are totally different. And someone has to point that out. And if that pointing out stopped the escalation of the Vietnam War and actually led to the end of the Vietnam War in the 70s, maybe that gives us hope that de-escalation is still possible thanks to the whistleblower. And just like the military men and women that work to de-escalate war and kill off the bad guys, and while under fire and artillery, maybe whistleblowers should have a wreath laid for them as well, for their part in trying, in sacrificing, in dedicating their life to making sure the American people are in the know, in the truth. Maybe they too should get a wreath laid for their honor as well, for their work in de-escalation as much as possible. Crazy thought if you were talking to 2013 me. But reading this article, it sort of softened me on this, and I say, well, if you have more information, come forward. Comer is looking for witnesses to come forward. I hope he has them. Because we need to know what's going on in today's world. In today's Biden industrial complex. And that's not a knock on Biden. That's just a want for the truth. They are running a Biden industrial complex. A syndicate. And we have to get to the bottom of it. And maybe this article, if you share it with the witnesses that are supposed to come forward, maybe that'll be a huge inspiration to Rep. Comer's quest to find out all he can about the Biden industrial complex. And maybe now we can look at whistleblowers as heroes, not traitors to the state. Have a great Sunday, and we'll talk to you soon on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network.